Hello everybody, my name is Boulevard and welcome to yet another Tournament Tactician. Now, last week I was about as confident as I could be for a week 1 tier list, especially given the lack of information on the previous meta that I had because I was returning from a holiday break. This week I'm feeling a little bit more confident, but about as confident as I can for how open the meta has shaken out to be. If you didn't check out my Giant Slayer tournament recap article, I did mention that over the two events that we were really looking at, the Mastering Runeterra and Runeterra Life events, there were 22 unique decks within the top 8 of each of those events. And what that means is that there's a lot of fucking decks, because 22 is the same amount of decks that we had in the top 32 of the Monuments of Power seasonal. It's way too many to articulate and keep track of on a tier list. So again, I do want to reiterate for anybody new out there, maybe you've just discovered me recently, the purpose of this tier list is that anything on it, even tier 3 decks, can win a tournament. Anything that I have left off of the tier list is either an oversight by me, which usually I'll overlook like one deck a week, really no more than that, most of the time it's 0, or I do not think the deck is good enough to win a tournament. For example, Lurk is not on the tier list. I do not think Lurk is going to win one of these big open tournaments. So, because there's so many different decks, I'm really going to be focusing more on broad strokes meta because we are still in a heavy developmental phase. We're still 3 weeks out from the seasonal. Players are still very much throwing things at the wall to see what sticks, and as we continue to approach the seasonal, we'll have a much better idea of what that is going to look like, because that is the ultimate goal, is what are we going to be playing at the seasonal, what is going to be performing well there, and I have a very good track record of keeping a solid, tight tier list for the seasonal specifically, so I hope that all of you new viewers, even if I continue to get things wrong over the next couple of weeks, you will give me a chance on that one. So without further ado, let's actually jump into the tier list. So obviously up at the top, we're still going to have AKX. This is still one of the best decks in the game. It's still pretty meta warping. The tough to nail down part of it is that while we have this aggro versus control sort of war waging on within the meta, AKX doesn't really fit cleanly on either side of that. Yes, the Absolver version is aggressive, but I wouldn't really label it an aggro deck the same way that I would Spiders, and the Go Hard version is a little bit more control-y, but I wouldn't really call it a control deck like I would Anivia. Instead, it's really just coming down to the matchup charts and the differences that they have, whereas Go Hard is beating aggro a little bit, or doing a little bit better against aggro, and beating the Mirror, whereas Absolver is doing a little bit better against control. And it's really just going to come down to which do you expect to see more of, because while Ariken and Go Hard is winning the Mirror, if your opponent has Ariken and Absolver, what is the rest of their lineup? Are they actually leaving open your Ariken and Go Hard, or are you kneecapping yourself by thinking that you have a counterplay lined up, and instead they just ban your Ariken, and then their Absolver runs over one of your other decks because it is still Ariken, so on and so forth. Don't really need to defend this one, don't want to spend too much time on it. Now, as for the control aspects, when we actually get into this control versus aggro thing, we have Darkness and Anivia. Anivia is in tier 1 because according to the matchup charts that I've been looking at from Master and High Diamond player, because there's not an insane amount of Masters data, Anivia is more or less beating all of the other control decks while still having that good aggro matchup. Now, Darkness is tier 1 because it is doing just a little bit better into the general field than a lot of the other control decks. And, you know, Darkness is one of the things that is beating AKX relatively reliably, about as reliably as you're going to for a deck that is not looking to smork it down. Now, one thing that is surprising to me is that, according to the head-to-heads that I've been looking at, Anivia is beating Darkness. Now, obviously, you think, oh, you just mini-morph the Anivia. They're playing 6 Anivias, you're only playing 2 to 3 mini-morphs, so that doesn't always work out that way, especially because with the other side of the field being aggro, you don't want to all-in on winning the control mirror and then kneecap your aggro matchup, because you are not just guaranteed to beat them because you're a control deck. That's not how it works. But one thing that players do need to keep in mind is, if we are going to be in this control versus aggro meta, and control is going to continue to uptick because it did so well on the previous week, then you do need to include ways to win the control mirror a little bit more proactively, because at the start of the round, you know that you only have 50 minutes on the clock. And I want you thinking about the timer sometime before the last 5 fucking minutes of the match. I want you to put cards in your deck that allow you to win more proactively, by which I really just mean more Rekindlers, because that is a good card in the control mirror that is a proactive way for you to win the game. Now, I still don't necessarily understand how Anivia is beating Darkness, because even, you know, putting aside the mini-morph on the Anivia Herder sort of play, Mist's Call is just a very good card for Darkness that should hose other control matchups. You play a Vigar on 4, they Piercing Darkness or Vengeance it, you Mist Call it right back. Now, I can see a problem where Anivia is running so few units that you can't reliably actually get down your Darkness and level it up in the way that you need to. But ultimately, I still feel like it should be a Darkness-favored matchup. And maybe it is in tournaments. It's one that I'm going to keep my eyes on a little bit more. But for the most part, if you are running into a control mirror, it does seem like Anivia is the ban, as that is the one that is doing the best against other controlled decks. Then, continuing down in Tier 1, we have Faded. Now, there's a big difference in the charts between Shyvana Pantheon and Mono Pantheon. Mono Pantheon was the one that performed a little bit better last weekend, with Trickster Sari taking second place at, I believe it was the Mastering Runeterra event, but it might have been the Runeterra Life event. Regardless, Pantheon did pick up a second place finish. And Pantheon is fine into everything. For the most part, any matchup that is a 45-55, I am willing to say that player skill will swing it on the other side of the fence, and Pantheon has a fair amount of 45% matchups into the top decks of the format, and it's doing pretty well into some of the more rogue decks of the format. So ultimately, Pantheon is just like very good across the board, very solid across the board. It's not really stomping anything, but it's also not really getting stomped by anything, except Shyvana Pantheon is getting absolutely hosed by spiders. So I am a little bit more on the Mono Pantheon camp for now. It does seem to have the better charts. And I think that part of that is just, you know, playing less of the dragon support. You're not, like, clogging up on these dragons' clutches and these screeching dragons and things of that nature is, like, the big difference. But again, these sample lists are up to date. I just went through and updated all of these, so you can click around a little bit. If a build looks weird, just know that I probably got it from a tournament last weekend. You can take it up with that player. But ultimately, I think that Pantheon is still, like, enough of a middle ground deck that it deserves a tier 1 spot, because it is just, like, a little bit above the things that are in tier 2 and tier 3. And you're going to find that a lot of this tier list, especially for this week, is, like, subjective within the, like, you know, maybe this isn't necessarily tier 1, but it's better than everything in tier 2, and that by definition should make it tier 1. Same thing with, like, tier 2. One of the reasons that, like, Anivia is tier 1 but something like Field of Rush isn't is because you can only run one Shadow Isle Freljord deck, and that means that if you have to pick between Anivia and Field of Rush, Anivia would be the tiebreaker. This is meant to sort of give you a, you know, obviously I still want you to formulate your own opinion, but if you're looking for a tiebreaker, here it is. And then when we talk about spiders, obviously this is, like, just sort of the best aggro deck in the game that we have right now, with spiders, Pirates, and Draven Rumble Burn being the aggro lineup from the previous week, as I had called out. Now it looks like Scouts might be overtaking Pirates for the weekend. That remains to be seen. I'm really not big on Scouts. I'm not super big on Pirates either, though. I think both of the Pirates definitely kind of felt like the weak link of the Spider, Draven Rumble, and Pirate lineup. So if you want to replace that with Scouts, it's perfectly fine. I'm not super big on Scouts either, though, but I've never been huge on aggro, so it is what it is. But for the most part, Spiders does feel a cut above the other aggro decks at the moment. It's the one that you're going to see splashed outside of triple aggro lineups. It's the one that you're going to see in, like, these counter AK lineups and things of that nature. I think that Spiders is just, it deserves to be a cut above the rest of the aggro decks, but it is still an aggro deck. But it is the best one, and I think that triple aggro is still completely viable, especially given the fact that most people are going to be looking to beat the control decks that performed well on the previous weekend. Now, tier 2 is where I probably need to defend myself a little bit, which is reasonable. So Draven Rumble Burn, still the second best aggro deck in the game. Don't really think we're going to get too much argument on that one. Field of Rush, it's weird because, like, it's not really the third best control deck, because you can only, like, you can't run it in the same lineup as Anivia, but it is still a very solid control deck, and one that you can interchange with Anivia within your own lineup based on playstyle. And one thing to keep in mind is that Field of Rush will probably end games a little bit faster than Anivia. If you are running triple control, you might want to swap out the Anivia for the Field of Rush so that you don't end up going to time as often, especially given the fact that the Mastering Runeterra event is single elimination. You really don't want it to come down to the clock and have things get a little finicky for you there. You want to be a little bit more control of your own destiny. So if you are going triple control, FTR over Anivia might be the thing for you if you do play at a reasonable to slow pace. It's really only the faster players that should be running triple control with Anivia, especially if you're pairing that with other decks that are very slow to win the game. Now, on to landmarks. I think that landmarks in general are going to do very well into control matchups, and that's not a radical take. I think by the time we get to the seasonal, control decks will need to tech a little bit of more landmark removal. We might see more It That Stares that pop up, but for the time being, I don't think that control is going to be so popular that we're going to see landmark decks popping up as often to counter them, so you can still get away without running It That Stares for now, but in 2 weeks, check back with me on that one. Now, the reason that Zillion Xerath is above its counterparts like Thralls and Bandletree, sort of these other hard to interact with WinCon decks, is that one, it's not doing better into aggro. None of these are really doing great into aggro. Thralls is probably doing the best, and then Bandletree right behind it because they have so much removal. Landmarks doesn't really have that, but Landmarks is doing better into AKX than Bandletree or Thralls would. And a big part of that is obviously going to be the pings from Xerath, and I think that the deck is proactive and different enough. Like, it's definitely gaining popularity, but I still think that a lot of players are going to get caught off guard by the playstyle of it, and it's going to perform a little bit better in a vacuum than Thralls or Bandletree would for a reason like that. It also has a nice amount of fearsome blockers, which is something that Thralls and Bandletree can struggle with, because Thralls really looking to get down like Elise and Avarosan Sentry in the early game. If you find a Tavern Keeper, great, but if you don't, you can really struggle with Spiders, whereas Landmarks has plenty of fearsome blockers between the Endless Devout as well as Zareth and the Rockhopper. That's the one. So don't take the Landmarks in tier 2 too seriously. I just wanted to highlight that like this is a general strategy that is going to perform well against Control if that is something that you're looking to counter. However you want to do that, maybe you're like, oh, well, I'm going to bring like Absolver, Ari, and then Anivia because it's beating all the other Control decks, and then I'm going to bring Landmarks. Something along those lines. You know, not necessarily in that order, but I did want to highlight that this is a deck and an archetype in general that is performing well into the meta, but still really hasn't figured out the aggro matchups just yet. So it is still a bit of a risk, especially in a single elimination event like Mastering Runeterra, but for the online league series, you know, come in, get a little bit of practice on it. If you scrub out, maybe you change it up for the Mastering Runeterra event. And then Spooky Viego, this one looks weird, right? So in the grand scheme of things, Kindred Viego is actually really solid. The parts where it struggles are Ari Kennen, Anivia, and Spiders. And so basically it is not beating the best deck in any given archetype, but it is actually doing very well into everything else. And if you are looking to ban the best, like if you run into a triple control archetype, Anivia is the best control deck, so we ban Anivia, relatively speaking. So we ban Anivia, then we actually do pretty well into the other control decks that we have run into. If we run into aggro and we ban Spiders, we're actually doing okay into the other aggro decks. And I think that Spooky Viego is something that players have slept on a little bit. Like, obviously, Sentinel Control is a great way to make use of the Kindred, but I do think that Kindred Viego is actually a little bit better than people are giving it credit for. Not a lot better than people are giving it credit for, but a little bit better. And I would be excited to see somebody break this out this weekend, as it does seem to be doing fairly well on the ladder, and I'd like to see that translated into tournament play. And then for tier 3, this is kind of where we just put everything else, right? Like Bandletree and Thralls, they're obviously going to do very well into Control because they're landmark-based win cons, but they're doing pretty poorly into aggro. I was actually surprised to see how poorly Thralls is doing into aggro, given the amount of sweepers. Sentinel Control looking good, but, you know, it's not Spooky Viego, and ultimately Sentinel Control is not beating any of the other control decks, really. I think it did well into Feel the Rush. It did well into one of them, but for the most part, like, it is losing to Control. It's not doing as well against mid-range as you would want it to, and it's doing good into aggro, but, you know, it just kind of is what it is. It's a very solid deck for sure, but remember, tier 3 decks can still win a tournament. If it couldn't, it wouldn't be on the tier list. Iceborn Spiders getting a little bit of a facelift with the Broken Ball build, but ultimately still, you know, doing okay against Control, struggling a little bit with aggro. It walks a line pretty well, but for the most part, it's still pretty unproven, and I think the build hasn't quite been locked down just yet, so tentative. I'm kind of big on Iceborn Spiders, but I can't be like, there is a theoretical tier 2 build of Iceborn Spiders. I don't know what the fuck it is, but it exists, because that's not, what is that? So until we figure out what that build actually looks like, it's kind of chilling in tier 3 for the time being. Lee Sin, take a hike, you're still on vacation, we'll see you at the seasonal, I guess. Sivir Demacia, mid-range in general, there's not a lot of it running around the meta right now. It's still fine, but it's really just fine. You know, it can beat aggro, it can beat Control, but it's not feeling super favored into either one. And one thing that I did want to highlight that Sivir Demacia actually could learn from Landmarks is that I think Hourglass is just a very good card right now. Now, I'm not sure that it's necessarily a good card for Sivir Demacia, but I don't think it's a bad card. I mean, it does take a lot for a control deck to get through a Sivir, and if you can counter that for 2 mana with your Hourglass, maybe that is something the players should be looking towards. The problem with it in Sivir Demacia specifically is that there's not a lot of things worth Hourglassing. I mean, it's really just Sivir and whatever 5-drop you choose to run, be it Radiant Guardian or Vicarian Bruiser or Screeching Dragon. Maybe if we go back to the Ruin Runner build to play a little bit more anti-control because we do have the spell shields, then we could get an Hourglass in there. And I'm really just only talking like 1 Hourglass, but I do think that Sivir Demacia is something that could go undergo a little bit of a facelift again and find a decent amount of success into this polarized meta. Scouts is something that players have been picking up on this week. Gamebreaker, in his post-match interview as the champion of this week's EU Fight Night, said that he thought Scouts was pretty overrated. Generally, Scouts and Nightfall are 2 decks that come out at the bottom of the meta like, hey, you know, we're here to counter a bunch of things, and they perform fine. I've never really been huge on Scouts, especially because, like Gamebreaker mentioned, a lot of people aren't on the Stony Suppressor build. They're kind of just playing a more traditional Scout plan, and I think that it's better than Pirates. I'll give you that one. But I still think that there should be a better third aggro deck out there. We still haven't quite found it. I'm not quite sure that Scouts is it, but it is the flavor of the week aggro deck for this week. We'll see if that persists into next week. Elusive Rally still a little bit slept on, but it's doing very well into a fair amount of things in the meta. Just really not getting played too much, and it is still taking up sort of that poppy spot that is pretty uncontested right now. A little bit on the weaker side. It's more of a counter pick, kind of like Scouts of old, where like you probably shouldn't run this in a generic aggro lineup, but if you have a specific deck in mind, like AKX that you're looking to counter, then Elusive Rally actually performs pretty well into that. At least I think it was AKX. Iceborn Legacy Poros. You know, it came out last week. I had it in tier 1. I knew that it wasn't going to be super popular, but I thought it would actually put more than one person into a top cut of a tournament. It was a little bit underwhelming in that factor, but it did win a tournament, and that's really all that we can ask of it. Now, I think that it's going to stick around because it does beat all of the slower decks in the meta, and if Control is beating up on aggro, and those are the two main points of contention in the meta, then Control is going to go up, and Iceborn Legacy Poros will be a little bit better. Should you run this? Probably not. Can you run this? Absolutely. That's kind of what tier 3 is. Pirates, like I mentioned, kind of the third best deck, probably going to get replaced by Scouts this week. Now, obviously, I would like to put one of these in tier 2 because Scouts and Pirates are fighting for your misfortune spot, but they're both also fighting for your third aggro deck spot. So they're kind of like, I don't have a tiebreaker here for you is kind of what I'm trying to get at. Scouts and Pirates are both equally underwhelming in my opinion. Now, obviously, Scouts is going to be the more popular choice, but Pirates is still a defendable one. And then Yordles in Arms, looking a little janky, but sorry, did pick up a second place finish with this in the previous week, and I don't think the deck is really going anywhere in terms of we'll still see one of it in the top 8 of something this weekend. And that's that on the tier list. Now, keep in mind that the meta is in an extremely fluid state at the moment. This is not gospel. Check back in 3 weeks when the seasonal is here. I'll have some gospel for you. This is not it. This is really just me looking at last week, trying to project how that's going to play out into this week, and kind of tiering things based on where they fall within their own archetype, whereas like Darkness and Anivia are the best control decks. Those are probably the ones that you're going to be banning if you run into a triple control lineup. If you run into Spiders, Draven Rumble, and Scouts, you are probably banning Spiders unless you have some decks in your lineup that Scouts is just doing a lot better than, because Scouts is a little bit more polarized in that sense. But ultimately, you know, just kind of look at this, use your brain, talk to your friends about what you think you should be running, because things are still a little bit all over the place. But as the weeks go on, it's going to get a little bit better. Be sure to check back on Tuesday for my tournament wrap-up article with Giant Slayer. And of course, in the description below, the tournaments that are happening this weekend, the Online League Series, as well as the Mastering Runeterra Qualifier number 5. The signups are down below, so get in on that action. We're approaching the point where, like, things are still fluid enough that, like, you don't have to grind both tournaments, but I think that grinding tournaments to be on top of the evolution of the meta and getting an idea of what you liked and did not like now, 3 weeks out from the seasonal, is a pretty good time to start doing that. So looking forward to casting for you guys this weekend again. And if I were playing this weekend, I would be bringing Ari Kennen Absolver because I like the fact that it is a little bit better into control. I would bring Darkness because it is one of my favorite decks in the game. And I'd probably just kind of say, you know what, if I lose to aggro, I lose to aggro. And I would play my third deck as probably Bandletree because it is one of the decks that I am the most comfortable on. And I really like it, you know, as sort of this anti-control deck. And I think that I've played enough Bandletree versus aggro that I have a sense of how to navigate the matchup. It might be unfavored on paper, maybe I'd even lose it, but I think that Bandletree, Darkness, and Ari Kennen Absolver are the way that I would be going this weekend. Now, I would have to adjust my Bandletree deck a little bit. I'd have to drop the Kennen from it, keep that in mind, but I think I'd find a way to make it work out. So, thank you so much for watching. As always, my name is Boulevard, and good luck in your tournaments.